21st Century Entrepreneurship with Martin Piskarik.
Obviously, I exist in kind of a unique space, right? This personal security space. And when I deal with a lot of executives and business professionals, this is something that is sort of an ancillary concern. But for my clients, it's a primary concern. And really, what it is that I do is that I protect people and organizations, and I teach them how to protect myself. I started way back, as a Marine officer, got out of the Marines in 96, kind of landed in the close protection world, a fancy pants way of saying bodyguarding. Protected a variety of people from, Benjamin Netanyahu when he was the former prime minister of Israel, to Warren Buffett, to Tom Cruise, a variety of high-placed people, just to name a few. My personal philosophy that I arrived at around 2003, so 23 years now, is that to me, it's good to have a lifeguard, but ultimately you should know how to swim. I arrived at this sort of philosophical shift for a variety of reasons. But at the end of the day, what I shifted gears to doing is to teaching people and organizations how to protect themselves with the same skills and tools we use to protect public figures. One of the reasons why I did this is because in my time, if you will, throughout the course of my career and for the majority of my life, focusing on this idea of human violence, I've come to two very specific opinions. And, they're the basis of my book. They're the basis of all of my teachings. And what they are two myths that people have. The one is what I call the myth of helplessness, and the other one is what I call the myth of randomness. And the myth of helplessness is sort of like the story that I like to think of is the story of how they used to train circus elephants back in the day. It's not a happy story, but what they used to do is chain a baby elephant to the ground with a stake in the ground, and it's this baby elephant would pull and pull in that chain until eventually it gives up. And what happens and what this means is that when the elephant is fully grown and it's the largest, most powerful land mammal on the planet, it's conditioned to believe that it is helpless when a human handler tries to lead it around on the end of the rope. And this story reminds me of the very definition of what we would call in psychological terms, as learned helplessness, right? It resonates with me because so many of my clients that they've conquered the business world. They have, multiple companies very often. The economics is no longer a factor. They live in safe neighborhoods. They generally are protected, well protected, but they gravitate in many ways towards training with me or doing some sort of level of consulting with me because there's a lingering doubt. And what that doubt is what would I do if I had to protect my family? What would I do if I'm traveling and something were to happen? Would I freeze? Would I just panic? Would I know how to respond? And I think this is a very human dynamic, is that we want to know how to respond to dangerous situations and know that we are not helpless. And my personal conviction is that we are never helpless as long as we can control one factor, if that factor is our mind, our ability to think and make decisions. It is so far less about the physicality of things, in terms of, am I big enough, strong enough? A lot of people immediately gravitate their mindset towards those things of, I'm a 100-pound woman. How do I defend myself against a 300-pound guy? But the reality is that it's not about that as much as it is about the ability to think and make decisions and not freeze. So a lot of my training and a lot of the consulting work I do is to get around this idea of this myth of helplessness and all of the factors in our society that, and very often they are well-meaning factors that have sort of enabled the same type of conditioning, if you will, to us as that elephant tied to a stake. And then the second component of what I deal with and how I address it is this idea of the myth of randomness. And the myth of randomness is a very powerful issue. In fact, this is kind of the first level, if you will, of discussion that I usually get into with people, is that when we talk about violence as a society and in general around the world, we attribute terms like random to that violence. You know, we say things like in the news media, it was an act of random violence. Nobody saw it coming. Someone just snapped. But the reality is that violence is never random, right? It is a process. And it's a process often as observable and predictable as boiling water if you know what to look for and are in a position to see the signs. When we label violence as random, what we are effectively saying is that violence is unpredictable. And if it's unpredictable, then what possible responsibility do I have? But that is really not the case. So our first objective is always to teach people how to think differently about violence and about this one most uncomfortable aspect of the human interaction. And how do we spot the warning signs in advance so that you can actually avoid the trouble or deter the threat before it ever becomes a physical issue? And in many ways, that is the very basis of close protection, executive protection, bodyguarding, whatever label we want to put on it. So in many ways, that was the thrust, if you will, of me discussing with you is I'm on a mission to really enable people who listen to me to empower them with greater skill sets so they can think differently about this idea of how to recognize danger and avoid trouble in the first place. Digging in a little deeper in the idea of this myth of helplessness, which is, you know, my book, Live Ready, which I'll just show you real quick. It looks like this. It is really designed as a handbook. You know, how do you, everything you need to know, including the questions that you may not know to ask about this subject matter in a very mainstream kind of way. So there's enough science in it to understand the basis of why I'm making certain assertions. At the same time, there's no martial arts techniques in it. It is all about the soft skills and understanding this concept and how do you go from wherever you are now to the next step. But the idea here is if we think about the myth of helplessness, as I mentioned it earlier, that the goal is to be able to think and make decisions and effectively avoid the natural paralysis response that occurs under stress. So if we take, for example, an extreme situation, like an active shooter event, a terrorist event, something like that, survivors very often tell the same story. They say things like, I didn't know what to do, so I played dead. And what I can tell you is that playing dead was not a conscious coping mechanism. What it was an extreme paralytic reaction, classically referred to as tonic immobility. It's the normal reaction that we have under stress of, oh shit, right? We freeze in indecision and we get stuck, but it elongates to a much more extreme kind of dynamic. Now, that freeze dynamic, whether it results in complete paralysis or just a temporary inhibition or inability to think and make decisions, what causes that? Well, what I like to share is a little story, Martin, if you don't mind. You know, it's how I actually, believe it or not, got started along this whole path. And it was before the Marine Corps. So in the early 90s, I was going to college. I went to the University of Pittsburgh. And, I was on the wrestling team. I had done martial arts. I thought of myself as a tough guy. And a friend of mine comes up to me and he says, "Hey, Sam, do you want a job where you can meet lots of girls but get paid next to nothing?" And I said, "Of course." So the next thing I know, I'm working as a bouncer in a college bar. And I was the sort of crisis response plan that I was taught at this bar amounted to a conversation with my manager, which was, okay, you guys hang out in the vestibule of the bar, check IDs, and if something goes south in the bar, we're going to flash the lights in the vestibule, and that's your signal to come running in and figure it out. I didn't know any better at the time. I was 20 years old. I wasn't even old enough to drink in the bar, but I thought, okay, that makes sense. So I was on my second shift, literally. It was a Friday night. The place is jam-packed. I'm sitting there trying to check IDs and look like I know what I'm doing, and the lights flash. So, me being the gung-ho guy that I am, I got to be the first one through the door, make my way through the crowd at this fight that's going on. And it was a bit of an anomaly because there was what looked like in my 20-year-old brain, it looked like an older guy, right? He was probably not even 40 at the time, but he didn't fit in the context of the college bar. And I make my way to the fight. The older guy was kind of getting the better of this college kid. I pushed the older guy off of the kid. I pinned the college kid to the bar because I didn't want him to come back swinging. And my assumption was that my fellow bouncer was right behind me, would grab this guy. And he hesitated. Well, the older guy didn't. He kind of bounced off the crowd a foot away, sticks a gun in my face, and says, "Now I'm going to kill you." And, it all happened like that. And, what was interesting was, how they say your life flashes before your eyes, you hear that in the movies. I can tell you my life did not flash before my eyes. It has never, in any of the situations I've been in that would, I think, objectively qualify as life or death. But what was interesting was my brain instantaneously jumped back to a little flashback memory of me having a conversation with my dad when I was like 12. And I was doing karate at the time or something, and I had this question. I asked my dad, "What do I do if a guy's got a gun?" And he told me in a very well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful way. He says, "Do whatever the guy with the gun tells you." So this memory took a millisecond. I fast forward to the moment, and the problem is the guy had threatened me, but he wasn't giving me any direction. He wasn't telling me to do anything. So the little computer program that I'd put in so early in my life, just failed. And it was almost like the hourglass on the computer screen coming up, and it just froze. And it was processing, but it didn't compute. And, this was the first time, even though I was no stranger to adrenaline, that while I'm stuck in this kind of hesitation, this non-computing moment, that all of a sudden, like, everything got quiet, right? And there was like hundreds of people in the place, and all I could see was the barrel of the gun, and it looked about this big. And this delay process, this paralysis effect, felt like it lasted minutes, even though it was probably objectively just a few seconds. And, at some point I processed, the little voice in my head says, "Okay, this is unproductive. We need to do something here." So I kind of looked around the gun at this guy's face, and his body language indicated to me that he probably wasn't going to shoot me in the face. He looked like he'd overreacted. So I was able to grab the gun, and we kind of negotiated our way out of it. Nobody got shot, and that was a good thing. The interesting thing about this experience was not how it was resolved. It was a little while later when we were back in the vestibule going back about our business. My fellow bouncer turns to me and he says, "Sam, they're paying us like $35 a night before taxes for this job." He goes, "This isn't worth it," right? He'd made his risk assessment, and that was the end of it. And I appreciated his perspective, but my brain didn't go there. It got hung up on a question. And the question was basically, what the hell just happened here? Why is it that everything that I thought I knew about violence and its management was demonstrated instantly to be false? And the first thing that made me very uncomfortable was the realization that it was not my body that had failed me. It was my mind, right? It was this reality that I was bigger, stronger, faster, younger, I was in great shape than the guy that I was dealing with. None of that physicality had any bearing on the equation because my mind lost the ability to process and think during that stressful moment. And this made me uncomfortable because I'd certainly heard stories about people who could think and make good decisions under pressure. And I wondered, what quality did they have that apparently I did not? And is this something that could be learned? Is this something that could be taught? So that led me on this journey of, instead of becoming a school teacher, which was the direction I was headed in school, I pivoted my college career, went through the OCS program, joined the Marines, yada, yada. Here we are today. At the core of this myth of helplessness is this idea that we all implicitly understand that in a crisis situation, if you haven't been there and done that, you don't know what you're going to do. And you don't know whether you're going to rise to the occasion or not. And there's an old saying in the Marines and in the military, is a maxim that says, it goes back 2,500 years to a Greek warrior poet named Archilochus. And it says that we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our training. And this is a truism. So when you mentioned to me some of your experiences boxing and things like this, to be more holistically well-rounded, it's not just about the mind, it's about the body. The concept of the myth of helplessness is there's only one way to overcome paralysis and to sort of circumvent it in advance. And what that is experience. And the challenging thing is that you can get experience only one of two ways, the easy way or the hard way, right? The hard way is get in a bad situation, somehow survive, and then you have a very powerful learning, even though I would argue that it's a very, very narrow perspective, right? The easy way is to learn from the research and data that has been collected around a subject for many generations and collated into a process that says, through training, here's what you need to know. So one aspect of this equation is to gain that experience in such a way that you're not in danger, but you can benefit from people who have been in danger and who have gone through it and now understand, both from a research and data perspective, but also from the reality of how does the human body perform under stress? How does the mind perform? What are the factors that make it challenging to think and that inhibit good performance? And how do we accomplish competent training around that? So one aspect is the physical training for how do you defend yourself, right? And one of the challenges that I've experienced with a lot of my clients is these are usually type A people. They're usually business owners. They're usually professionals who have really, like I said, conquered in many ways their industries. And they aren't really in danger. So the question is, why are they seeking training? They're not professionals in the line of fire, but they seek it because it's human. We want to know on a primal level that we can protect ourselves in the things that we love, our people and the things that we care about most. And to understand violence at that level, it's almost like Maslow's pyramid, right? These folks have certainly accomplished the essentials. How do I have food, clothing, shelter, and those sort of basic, fundamentals of human needs. And then, of course, as the pyramid goes up, it goes through safety and security to belonging to esteem, all the way to self-actualization. And when on a primal level, you don't think that you can protect yourself or you're not sure, it's like a loose rung on the ladder, right? You're not quite mastered yet. The thing about it is, I encourage everyone to do training. It just has to be the right training, because so much of the folks that I've worked with have done jiu-jitsu, or they've done boxing, or they've done sport-oriented stuff, and that's very good. But the problem with it is it's not necessarily viable for the real world of violence, which involves weapons, multiple opponents, and a ton of unknown factors. There's this component here on the physical level that we talk about, controls and expectations, right? So, Martin, if you and I got into a competitive, fight, whether it's a mixed martial arts bout, cage match, whatever it is, boxing match, we both know, I know you're not bringing a gun to the fight or a knife. I know your friend's not going to jump me from behind. And if things get too dangerous, I can always tap out, or refuse to go on. Or if I can't tap out, well, the ref's there to save me, right? The thing is, none of those controls or expectations exist on the street. So we have to have a different technology for how do we process that. And in many ways, that's dealing with the worst case moment or few moments in someone's life, right? What I prefer to do through the myth of randomness is get way ahead of the curve so that not only do you have the basic skill sets to know what to do and how to do it under stress if you had to defend yourself, but beyond that, know how to recognize the danger in advance so that you can see the problem coming and avoid it entirely. That to me is what personal security is all about and why it's not just self-defense. Self-defense, teaching a workplace how to respond to a critical incident like an active shooter event, these are all extremely important things. But what's most important is recognition of the threat in advance and avoiding the trouble in the first place. I don't know a single parent who would rather their kids be super good at fighting their way out of trouble than being able to recognize it and avoid it and make the right decisions in advance. So to me, what I'm big on is right out of the gate, situational awareness training, which is one of the reasons why if your listeners stick to the end, I've got a free gift for them that I've never given away before. It's one of my courses that I only give to my clients, my paying clients. But what it is a not just a crash course, it is a deep dive into how do you tune your situational awareness. And the basis of that is, a lot of people that I know, maybe yourself included, are people who already pay attention. They're already aware. But I want you to understand that is just the prerequisite, right? What we really want to do is understand that we see with our mind, not with our eyes. So what it requires is a retraining of how we think and know how to observe and what specifically we are looking for, when to know how to turn on and when we can switch off, and then specifically how do you observe. So we can go through some of those elements right now, which I'd be happy to. But again, I put it into a course that is going to be deliverable to your listeners, just because I love the fact that you go so far ahead. Martin, when we talk about situational awareness, and I always talk about, you've heard me say it before, that paying attention is just the prerequisite. We got to know how to look, when to look, what to look for. Let me give you an example, just a really fast, something to think about. If you think about every place that you go, right, whether it's a parking lot or an office building, whatever it is, that place has a purpose, okay? So one way of retraining our mind is to imagine, say a parking lot, for example. The purpose is very specific, right? You go into the parking lot, you park a car, go into the store, come out, leave, whatever it is. Well, when you're entering into that environment, one of the easiest things you can do is when you're scanning your environment, scan and look for anomalies. And it's easy to see someone who is not using the environment for its dedicated purpose. So in other words, most people are coming and going. And when you're in a parking lot and you see someone who's loitering around and not using it for its dedicated purpose, the question that's going to pop up in your head is, what's going on here? And you can pretty well easily evaluate someone's body language of someone who's waiting for a ride, for example, versus someone who's watching, who's coming and going. So if we start to understand that two lessons in one here is that we want to enter environments knowing that when we're scanning, what we're looking for is those anomalous behaviors that people are not using the environment for its dedicated purpose, and specifically watching for watchers. And the interesting thing is that when you get into the habit of doing this, you become a watcher yourself. And it's almost like two predators arriving at a watering hole, right? There's easier targets around. So, one of the easiest ways to take yourself off the menu, so to speak, is for those watchers to see you and realize that you are a watcher as well. Way too hard of a target right off the bat. So the conditioned behavior by simply going into the environment and saying, okay, what am I looking for? I'm going to scan my environment. What am I looking for? Is the anomalous behavior that someone's not using that environment for its purpose. And when you see someone who's a watcher, instantly your radar goes up. Now, the concept here is a friend of mine once mentioned this, and I love this little analogy. He says he lives in New York City, and he says, Sam, I always summarize your situational awareness training to my friends who visit me this way. He says, there's three kinds of people in New York. There's the people who are looking up. He goes, they're the tourists. There's the people who are looking down. They're the New Yorkers. But you really want to pay attention to the people who are watching for who's looking up and who's looking down. They're the ones you need to pay attention to. And I love that idea because it's easy to remember. But if you were listening to this right now and you wanted to say, how do I teach my kids to be more aware? Well, the first thing is get them off their phone and get their head up and paying attention, but then give them a few tools of what to look for. And, knowing that every place has a purpose and watching for watchers are simple tools that we go into much greater depth with in the book and in the course. But the concept, and I would layer this one other way, is knowing your options. Here's a really easy trick I teach everyone I can. Train your kids in this way. Every time you go to a restaurant and you sit down at the table, your kids should know that you're going to ask them, where is the kitchen? And the reason why you want to know where the kitchen is and why you want them to be able to scan their environment immediately upon entering for certain things is because there's always an emergency exit through the kitchen. So it's not just about positioning your seat so you can see what's going on. At the same time, you want to know when you enter the environment, what are my options? If I have to get out of here in a hurry and the door that I came in is no longer valid, what are my options to get out? And there's always going to be an emergency exit out through the kitchen because restaurants don't want to take the garbage through the front door. So the concept is anywhere in the world that rule applies. So there's tricks of the trade like this that become second nature habits just with a little bit of encouragement, and they completely transform someone from being sort of a passive, rider on the bus to being able to drive the bus themselves. So it's a very, very powerful tool. But like I said, that's just an example. We go into depth in this stuff in the radar course and in the book. So grab those free courses. One of the things I respect about your show and you is that you're always going above and beyond for people. So in coming on to this show and preparing for this, what I decided to do was do something I've never done before, which is I wanted to take a couple of my critical elements that I teach just about everyone, my paying clients, the corporate clients that I work with, and I wanted to just give it away to your listeners as a way of me giving back to them, sharing their time with me. And the very first thing, and this is what I call the Protector's Protocol. So that package involves two things. The first thing is a digital copy of my book. So the entire book, all the research, the data, 25 years worth of information, the best practices that I've learned, in protecting people, teaching them how to protect themselves, it's all in there so that people can protect themselves, their family, their workplace. So the digital copy of that, it's an EPUB, it's also a PDF. The second thing, which I think is even almost more valuable in many ways, is an online course called Radar. And what the Radar class is this is not just some kind of short little segment. It is a course that I developed specifically to teach people how to recognize danger and to understand how our brain works so that we can tune the elements of our brain to be able to recognize danger in advance. In other words, we need to know, as I said before, situational awareness when it comes to, personal security. It really comes down to two things: being able to recognize danger and knowing what your options are. And, sometimes the options are to escape, sometimes it's to, respond. But the concept is that we see with our mind, not with our eyes. So it's not just about staying aware. You got to know what you're looking for and how to recognize the warning signs specifically that you may be being targeted. Okay, so this course will get into that. It will also get into how to overcome some of the natural inhibitions that our brain and the games our brain plays with us to sort of deny what we are seeing. All right, so when we start to observe a threat, how do we recognize it for what it is and not talk ourselves out of it? It is an invaluable course for anyone, whether you're an executive, a business owner, a kid going to college, teenagers. I couldn't stress it enough how valuable and important this class is, because what it does is it avoids the trouble in the first place. Many of my clients have already done martial arts. They've already done different personal security training. Some of them have done firearm instruction. The problem is that very often they feel sort of like they've spun their wheels, and that's not a problem with them. That's a problem with the way things are being taught. Because what you're learning is how to deal with the worst case moment and not how to recognize and avoid the trouble in advance. And that skill set is not being taught. So what I decided to do is to give this for free. So all I can say is this: your listeners, if they have interest in this subject matter and in me, I put together a specific landing page. It is century.liveready.co. Okay, so my website is liveready.co, liveready.co, and the specific landing page for the free gifts that are only exclusive and only available to you and your listeners is century.liveready.co. Okay, so I would just encourage everyone, go there, pick up the free gifts. Please don't share that link with anyone else. It's for your listeners only. And at the end of the day, my job is to empower people, and that's what I want to do. So whether someone engages with me beyond that or not is irrelevant. I want to front load these skills to as many people as I possibly can.
21st Century Entrepreneurship with Martin Piskarik.